F1's going to change its controversial engines in a big way for 2027. In theory, the FIA has announced, and excuse me while I look off screen to get the wording of this correctly, that there will be a nominal increase in internal combustion engine power by around 50 kilowatts and a reduction in the energy recovery system deployment power by the same total. So, in simple terms, more power from the V6, less power from the MG UK. John Noble, if this goes ahead, does this fix everything that's wrong with F1's engines?
It doesn't fix everything, but it goes an awful long way to curing the principal problem, which is energy starvation. There's not enough energy going in. There's not enough energy stored in the battery to allow enough power to come out. So you're shifting the numbers. We're going to go from 50-50, this fabled split between the internal combustion engine and electric power that's hung over these regulations, has triggered endless compromises on the way, and is now being removed, or aimed to be removed from the start of 27 into something that's more 60-40 with some other tweaks as well. It's not just this. We understand they're evaluating bigger batteries, so lifting up from 4 megajoules to 5 megajoules, and also increased harvesting. So in a bid to get more power in, you can harvest maybe 400 kilowatts or 450 kilowatts rather than the current limit of 350. So it's all adjusting the numbers. You can't create energy out of nothing. It's got to come from somewhere. But the more you put in, the more you can get out, and that hopefully should improve a lot of the problems we faced.
But this will all come down to it being agreed, and as usual, the devil will be in the details, because everything I said at the start is in principle, John, so it might not necessarily go ahead. It could all be derailed, and something that we do know about how this will be achieved, or how it's intended to be achieved, is the extra power from the V6, and these numbers are the equivalent of around 70 brake horsepower, will come via a fuel flow increase, and there's one obvious element to that. They're going to need bigger fuel tanks, aren't they?
The manufacturers and teams, in principle, which is what was in the press release, are in favour of the concept. This subtle shift will change things, but we live in a real world with real world complications. And one of the key ones in Formula One is cost cap. The teams are up against, all of them are up against the limit of the cost cap this season. Nudging that limit is forcing them to space out upgrades this season. And from what we understand, a lot of teams, maybe up to half the grid, were considering carrying over their chassis into next season. Will pull down costs a lot and put everyone on a better even keel. The problem is the chassis incorporates the fuel tank, and if you increase fuel flow by 10%, as the initial estimation suggests, then that means your fuel requirement will go up by 10%. And if your fuel tank for 26 is based on current fuel levels, it's not going to work for next season if you need 10% more. So this is one of the conundrums and complications that F1's now got to work through in technical meetings to establish what can be done in these circumstances. And there are only two realistic solutions here. The first one is you open up the cost cap. You say to teams, okay, we will allow you an extra allowance of whatever it costs to build a new chassis, and it's fine for next season as a one-off, and you can do it. Or the other option, more extreme and would be controversial, is if the fuel flow increases by 10% and your fuel flow currently is targeted at current race distances, at some venues, you just have to pull back the race distance by 10%, which I'm not sure everybody would be happy with.
Yeah, there's going to be a huge amount of discussion about this. I would be stunned if they end up with all parties in alignment. They'll probably be aiming for the least unpopular compromise. That will probably tell the stakeholders that they've reached something that sort of works. What's going to be very interesting is what details do emerge over the coming weeks, because I think it's fair to say, John, that this caught us by surprise, that they've agreed it to the extent that they have anyway, in terms of mapping out a solution. And I'm, in the interest of transparency, pleased that the FIA has taken the step of communicating this to the extent it has. Obviously, as we've already talked about, stuff that we've learned already and we're talking about here isn't in what the FIA's communicated. So beyond what we've talked about there, whether it's the implication of for fuel tank design, what you do in terms of freeing up the resource to make upgrades for next year, where do you see any of the other battlegrounds being played out here? Because there's obviously going to be a couple of manufacturers, one in particular, that has an absolute truckload of extra development allowance coming down the pipe for this year because they're so far off the pace, will they not be able to just shovel all of that into development of an all new engine tailor-made for the new regulations?
This is intriguing. I think as the discussions roll out, we are going to see a lot of unintended consequences from changes. We've seen already this with this rule set. You change one element of the car, it has complications in another, be it chassis into power unit or power unit into chassis. Everything's so interconnected. If you change the engine regulations for next year, so you've got to redo your ICE, then obviously we have ADOO, which is the additional development and upgrade opportunities. So those manufacturers that get granted ADOO, suddenly that looks to be a much bigger benefit into next season. So from what I understand, there's going to need to be discussions now about how do you get a compromise in this front? Because is it fair that if you're behind with this rule set, you get a head start into next year? I'm not sure that's something that all the manufacturers will accept, even though they've agreed a package to move Honda forwards. So I think this is the complications with this, making these changes into next season, that there are going to be consequences. You're going to have that race distance consequence, for example. And maybe the compromise on that is that these rules are staggered. So for 2027, we have the increased fuel flow and bigger batteries that only is there for qualifying, and we revert to a more normal setup in the race, because the race isn't causing as much controversy and downside and criticism as qualifying. And then for 28, you have the full package. But even that isn't agreed, because I think there is a general feeling that F1 can't just keep changing the regulations and bouncing from one tweak to another. It needs to get on, it needs to make the change. And the preference is to get the entire rule set sorted for the start of 27 and not let this drag on for another year.
It's quite remarkable that we are only 4 races into these rules and they have effectively agreed to change them twice now, because obviously we went into Miami and there were changes to the way that the engines were being run and lots of other tidy ups around the regulations after just 3 Grand Prix this season. And now, okay, this isn't rubber stamped and it's not changing this year, but now there's a much bigger change on the table for 2027 straight away. We've only had one race with the new version of F1 2026. Now, these things are connected in the sense that they're trying to address similar things, but they're not connected insofar as these rules are a knee-jerk reaction to what happened in Miami, obviously. But it is moving very quickly. Are you surprised, pleased that F1 and the various stakeholders are making these moves now? Because as I say, the speed with which they've done this has caught me out.
Yeah, I'm surprised they've gone as far as pushing through for a potential hardware change for 27. Even Miami last weekend, we walked around the paddock and you're speaking to manufacturers saying it can't be done. We've got either a chassis problem with a fuel tank, or it's going to take a big revamp of the power unit in time. We're only going to have the window shuts in 1 or 2 weeks to get this change happening, which seemed to be impossible to believe they'll get anywhere close to an agreement. But it's pushed on. The FIA has been very active on this front. It's been speaking to drivers, pushed on in the meeting today. It's got this agreement in principle. Doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to happen in this time frame, but the direction of travel is clear. And while with hindsight we can all sit here and say these problems with 50/50 were well known for ages, we've talked about it for 3 or 4 years now, that the potential for it not to work. Equally, there was a reality that perhaps we did need to see that it wasn't going to work, that people were pushing on. And while it would have been better to have made the change before we even started 2026, at least they've reacted, at least they've listened and responded and are making movement and are getting on with it, rather than burying their heads in the sand and thinking there isn't a problem, we can get our way out of this, which was clearly not a good solution for Formula One.
That was obviously a degree of some of the propaganda that was being pushed, though, that there weren't any problems and that everything was fine. We knew that behind the scenes it was different. They wouldn't have worked through the changes they did for Miami if there weren't things that could be better. We knew that there was a need to address things in a bigger way longer term, but maybe the FAA and the all of the people that have been involved in these discussions just wanted to mug us off, and they were paying attention to our video after the Miami Grand Prix weekend, where we went into the discussions about V8 engines definitely coming for 2030 or 31. And in that video, I'm pretty sure we talked about there definitely won't be changes of a particularly big magnitude before 2028 because it will take a bit of time to enact that. But it just goes to show just how quickly the landscape is changing here. And I do think we should, jokes aside, commend them for being front-footed on this, being proactive. I do subscribe to the view that we didn't need hindsight to change the rules. I think there were enough warning signs, and I think even by testing, it was very clear a lot of people were pushing for versions of this, maybe a reduction in the MGUK power output for qualifying, for example. But what do you think, for one final question, John, it will say about F1 if this doesn't go through, if something does derail it? Because if that happens, then the problems remain, even though they've all just admitted and agreed that the engines need to change.
I think they will go through in some form. I think at the very worst, we're going to end up in a scenario where the power units are going to have to be tweaked. You'll increase that fuel flow a little bit. You can pull back the deployment. Maybe we don't get bigger batteries. Maybe we can't change the harvesting limits. But just with those two adjustments, you could allow that to happen in qualifying, which would then resolve a lot of the problem. You get a more normal speed profile. It wouldn't cure anything. You still get some speed drop off when you go from straight mode to corner mode, like we saw in Suzuka in that run to 130R, for example. So it's not going to cure everything, but it would go a long way. And in the racing, we wouldn't notice. The racing has been entertaining. Some people claim it's artificial. Some people like it. But viewer figures are up. The fans seem to like it. So there's no crisis over the racing. The drivers have been unhappy about qualifying. This will go an awful long way to address it. So even if we only get half of this in for 27, it's probably enough of a step to then feel quite confident that for 28, we go the whole hog and we can finally get a rule set that F1 can be totally happy with.